Hi, BookTube. Today's novel is one of many works associated with the Harlem Renaissance. And if you're not familiar, that was a roughly 20-year period between 1920 and 1940 in the United States. There was an established and growing African American population in New York City at that time, mainly around Manhattan and Harlem, and that created optimal conditions for a cultural flourishing in music, art, and literature. During my degree studies, the university introduced us briefly, and I put the stress on briefly, to the Harlem poets Langston Hughes and W.E.B. Du Bois. But it felt, well, I wouldn't even call it skimming the surface. I knew I would need to come back. Okay, today we are reviewing Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, published in 1937 by J.B. Lippincott. I'm going to pitch this novel. Technically, the bottom line view of this novel is that it relates the story of a black woman living in Florida whose name is Janie Mae Crawford, and she marries 3 times. But onto that base layer, if you want the wholeness of Their Eyes Were Watching God, you have to add several layers. You need to add how young and inexperienced Janie is when she first marries, how much she has to accept the advice of those around her because she doesn't have any other source of wisdom. There are aspects of herself to be discovered, and that's another layer. Then there are the relationships she has with her husbands. Each man promises something different, takes her somewhere different, expects something different from Janie. That's another layer. And so the book proceeds, with Janie putting down all these layers of experience. And that isn't all. You will see as we discuss setting and narrative voice that there are yet more layers waiting for the reader to discover themselves. Okay, the technical things. How did I obtain this book? How long is it? How much did I pay? So this is where I get reminded of just how much information the internet keeps about me. Amazon tells me that I purchased the Kindle version of Their Eyes Were Watching God on the 15th of March this year. Now, I didn't put up my first BookTube content until the 27th of March. So I must have been busy watching content, and I went back, and YouTube, sure enough, in my history, tells me that I was viewing the booktuber Noelle Gallagher. She was talking about grad school and the assigned books that left the greatest impression on her. I'll leave a link to that video in my description box. Zora Neale Hurston's book was one of these. Now, the Kindle edition on that date happened to be on special offer at 50 pence. However, I will say that the typesetting on my version leaves a lot to be desired, okay? There were sometimes sentences with no spaces between the words, and the dialogue paragraphs weren't structured correctly. They would lump together one person A's words with person B responding, then leave a space and start with person A again, and then maybe a space again, and person B would talk, but then the next paragraph would lump A and B together. You can get the picture. It was very confusing to work out who was speaking. So I would recommend in this case, please choose a different format. Now, regarding length, my Kindle edition was 144 pages. Let's talk about the author. And by the way, in this photograph, Zora Neale Hurston is sitting in the chair that's directly below my camera image. Zora was born in 1891, and we know that her family relocated to Eatonville in Florida, which was a municipality incorporated entirely by black freedmen. And her father served there as the mayor of the town. Zora's higher education was delayed, but she was committed. She worked various jobs to fund the associate degree that she received from Howard University, while also being active in student government there and helping to found the college's newspaper. She received a scholarship in 1925 to Barnard College, Manhattan, and she graduated with a BA in anthropology. She did her PhD research at Columbia University, and she received a Guggenheim Award for that work. Contrast this with the end of Hurston's life, when, in spite the incredible quantity of ethnographic work and data and writing that she had gathered and contributed to various publications, and the number of books that she'd written, including Their Eyes Were Watching God, she nevertheless struggled to get work published. She died in a Florida welfare home, and she was buried in an unmarked grave when she died in 1960. That leaves a lot of questions about what happened in the middle, and the answer deserves more time than I can give in one of these short biographies. I recommend some extra reading to understand, yes, the discrimination she got from whites that held back and underpaid Hurston, but also there was criticism received from the black leaders of the Harlem Renaissance, which also contributed. She is not a person who can be quickly understood or summarized. She has layers just as much as her novels do. What I have done is leave a couple of links to academic work that's available free of charge on JSTOR, which will be the start towards a fuller understanding. Regarding the setting, Their Eyes Were Watching God is post-Civil War. It's early 20th century. I'm going to say post-First World War. There is a single mention of traveling by aeroplane. So we know that Jim Crow law is in force in the South, and it maintains a divide and a sharp difference between black and white Americans. Into this, you've got Janie Mae Crawford, the novel's protagonist. She settles with her second husband in Eatonville, Florida, that same black incorporated town that Hurston knew from her own childhood. It's the place Janie lives for most of her story, and it's the place to which she returns at the end of the novel because she owns property there. No matter where you are, really, the world of the book is exclusively black. It's an immersion into that culture. White people occasionally appear in Janie's story, but they stay briefly, and even when they're exercising civic power of some sort, they nevertheless seem to be at the fringes of what's really happening. We know they exist because decisions are made on the basis of their existence, but they're not the center of Janie's world or Janie's story. An interesting aspect of the setting in Eatonville is the focus on porches, front porches. The opening chapter describes Janie's return to the town from the viewpoint of her neighbors watching from their front porches. And they're noting every detail of Janie's appearance and speculating about what has happened when she was away and why she has come back. And it is in response to those front porch inquiries that Janie finally reveals the truth. Eatonville is called the town that freedom built, and yet we see Hurston creating a character who felt stifled there. I'm reading now from the opening of chapter 7. The years took all the fight out of Janie's face. For a while she thought it was gone from her soul. No matter what Jody did, she said nothing. She had learned how to talk some and leave some. She was a rut in the road, plenty of life beneath the surface, but it was kept beaten down by the wheels. Sometimes she stuck out into the future, imagining her life different from what it was, but mostly she lived between her hat and her heels, with her emotional disturbances like shade patterns in the woods, come and gone with the sun. This is an additional layer in Their Eyes Were Watching God, the question of how much freedom you can have in any rural community, and also the question of black freedom from a black woman's perspective. Let's talk about the narrative viewpoint and the narrative voice. This novel is a framed narrative. It begins with a third-person narrator whose vantage point is the front porch that I talked about earlier. They are sitting with all the neighbors. They watch Janie walk back to her house, and then the narrator follows Phoebe Watson as she pays a call with a plate of food. And then Janie and Phoebe sit together at Janie's kitchen table, and Janie begins telling Phoebe what she's experienced in life since she was 16. On page 9 of my Kindle version, the dialogue stops and the narrator takes over the telling. And because narrators can do magic, the viewpoint is transported back in time, and we are suddenly there with a younger version of Janie, and we're learning what she learns as she learns it. And it's a switch that was very well done. I didn't consciously notice it, not until I reached the point in the book where Janie had lost her third husband. And then suddenly all the porch conversation from way back in chapter 1 started to make sense. I knew that the narrative had done like a full time travel loop. It had gone back into the past, and it was riding through to the moment where we left Janie and Phoebe at Janie's kitchen table. And so there's a feeling of closure because of that loop, even though it's not really certain what Janie is going to do next. The narrative voice also has an amazing way with words. I want to share this short passage. It deals with female sexual awakening, and it uses the imagery of bees and flowers. So I'm quoting from page 10 of the Kindle edition. Janie was stretched on her back beneath the pear tree, soaking in the alto chant of the visiting bees, the gold of the sun, and the panting breath of the breeze, when the inaudible voice of it all came to her. She saw a dust-bearing bee sink into the sanctum of a bloom, the thousand sister calyxes arch to meet the love embrace, and the ecstatic shiver of the tree from root to tiniest branch, creaming in every blossom and frothing with delight. So this was a marriage. She had been summoned to behold a revelation. Then Janie felt a pain, remorseless sweet, that left her limp and languid. Does this novel fit any kind of genre category? It is a love story, but it will frustrate any reader who comes to the book with expectations set for, genre romance, because it's not a romance. This is yet another thematic layer in the novel, the question of what love is, really. When a relationship lasts, does that mean there's love? Can there be different ways of expressing love? And if a relationship has problems, how many of those problems and what kind of problems define a relationship as successful or unsuccessful? One distinctive feature of Their Eyes Were Watching God is the character dialogue. We can feel confident because we know Hurston lived in Eatonville, and because of her anthropological training and field work, which was done in Black communities throughout the Gulf states, we can be sure that the syntax and the vocabulary and the particular style of conversations, the call and response of the talk that you get on the Eatonville store porch, that these are faithful renditions. The internet has made me aware that Hurston's contemporaries in the Harlem Renaissance and some current readers are not so happy to have this language showcased in this way. And that's a debate I don't feel qualified to enter. I will say that I did not find any dialogue difficult to understand, and that my uneducated reaction to it, for example, to the conversations about Matt Bonner and his yellow mule in chapter 6, I was just amused. And I also got a strong feeling that the talking and the pranks were what helped ease social tensions and therefore strengthen the bonds of that community. Is there problematic content in the novel? There are instances of domestic abuse, and they're described in a way that makes clear that the cultural expectation at the time was that husbands and fathers were entitled to use physical violence on women. But we're not talking about anything prolonged, thank goodness, or repeated in the story. There is also one account of remembered abuse that involves a slave and a slave owner. Now, Hurston puts such a premium on detailed realism in her novels, and her ethnographic research would have included asking Black people for their memories. So I think it's very likely that some of those stories transferred into her fiction. Okay, any suggestions for related or follow-up reading? Nella Larsen was another novelist associated with the Harlem Renaissance, born in the same year as Zora Neale Hurston. I definitely want to add Larsen's book Passing to a TBR, when I can buy books again. And I would read more Hurston, hoping that I would get the same narrator's voice. I found it so beautiful. I'd like to close just with one more passage. This is from the end of the book, where Janie is remembering the man she loved most. Then Tea Cake came prancing around her where she was, and the song of the sigh flew out of the window and lit in the top of the pine trees. Tea Cake, with the sun for a shawl. Of course he wasn't dead. He could never be dead until she herself had finished feeling and thinking. The kiss of his memory made pictures of love and light against the wall. Here was peace. She pulled in her horizon like a great fishnet, pulled it from around the waist of the world and draped it over her shoulder. So much of life in its meshes. She called in her soul to come and see. There. So that's it, everybody. Now, I have a really good stretch of time booked off over the holidays, and my intention is to get some more reading done. For my next video, I'm going to continue my reading vlog about Orlando Fige's Natasha's Dance, A Cultural History of Russia. I'm on page 300 right now. And I also need to choose a new novel from the many that I own, and which I imagined would be a simple task until I realized it would mean making up my mind. Wish me luck on that, okay? Thanks very much for joining me for this review, and I hope the last days of 2023 will be productive reading ones and that you're getting excited about the new reading year ahead. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.